Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching Business Plus. I'm Shweta Kothari. We're bringing you stories from the world of business, policy and economy. The top story that we're tracking at this hour: global ratings agency Fitch has affirmed India's sovereign ratings, flagging a difficult fiscal consolidation path. Now, Fitch Ratings has affirmed India's long-term foreign currency issuers default rating to BBB negative. In its statement released on 16th of January, the ratings agency has said that India is poised to remain one of the fastest growing countries globally in the next few years. Now, global ratings agency including Fitch, Moody's and S&P have lowest investment grade rating on India with a stable outlook. So how fair are these ratings at this point in time, and how fair to rate India at the lowest level? Remember, India is one of the fastest growing major economies in the world, and while developed and developing nations are struggling, India is showing a potential for growth. In fact, India's economy is poised to grow at 7.3% in financial year 2024, even as growth in major economies around the world is decelerating. Even so, Moody's rating downgraded India to Baa3 from Baa2 in the month of June 2020 with a negative outlook, and S&P Global Ratings too has rated India as BBB negative with a stable outlook. These ratings are important, for these ratings are looked at by investors as an indicator of the country's creditworthiness as well as its impact on the borrowing cost. The relevance of rating agencies today, however, is questionable, but the world still counts on these agencies for, and investors specifically, for how to go ahead as far as investment opportunities in different countries is concerned. How fair are these ratings, and should they rate India negatively? Let's understand through our documentary that we made at News9, Battling the Bias.
All of these rating agencies have in the past not exactly covered themselves with glory. And many economies that have collapsed, and even many companies that have collapsed, have got glorious ratings.
It's almost akin to saying that is Facebook or Twitter biased against India just because it was incubated in the West Coast?
Suddenly they put us, India, at 161 out of 180 countries in press freedom. Now, I'm sure our press landscape is not perfect, but 161 out of 180, which puts us below Afghanistan and Sudan and Pakistan, which are all non-functioning countries. You've got to be kidding me.
S&P Global Ratings had recently upgraded India's GDP growth projections for the year 2024 to 6.4%. This was up from 6% it had given India earlier. Fitch had upgraded India's medium-term potential growth estimates by 70 basis points to 6.2%. Moody's had retained India's economic growth at 6.7% for the year 2023. All this in place, all three global rating agencies have left their sovereign ratings for India unchanged, a lower medium grade and an average rank of around 64, below the likes of Mexico, Panama, even Cyprus, and just above Colombia.
Well, all of these rating agencies have in the past not exactly covered themselves with glory. And many economies that have collapsed, and even many companies that have collapsed, have got glorious ratings, except that no one questions them subsequently. Having said that, is there a bias in favor of the developed countries and against developing countries and emerging market economies? The answer is patently clear. There is such a bias. It's a documented bias.
It's almost akin to saying that is Facebook or Twitter biased against India just because it was incubated in the West Coast? The reality is there could be a Western bias for sure.
Let's put things in perspective here. In May 2023, S&P assigned a rating of BBB, a notch above junk grade, to India. These very agencies have assessed India's economy as performing well, along with sound fundamentals underpinning growth over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, to any sound mind, that would seem like a contradiction, because scores of countries rated above India have floundering economies.
We discovered that there was a very peculiar pattern in this. For example, if you see, there is a think tank called the Reporters Without Frontiers, RSF, that's the French acronym. Suddenly they put us, India, at 161 out of 180 countries in press freedom. Now I'm sure our press landscape is not perfect, but 161 out of 180, which puts us below Afghanistan and Sudan and Pakistan, which are all non-functioning countries. You've got to be kidding me. I mean, clearly there is an agenda.
Sovereign rating agencies give 20% weightage on what they call ESG. ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance weightages. This is an abstract property. It can be best described as a set of practices that organizations and governments implement to limit any negative impact on the environment, society or governance bodies. Building a road is good for the economy, bad for the environment. How bad depends on who's sitting on judgment. Get the drift?
Forget the ESG alone. If I go to one part, which is the green taxonomy, how do you measure what is green? What is green financing? What is green activity? We don't have a formal taxonomy for green. If you don't have a taxonomy, what it means is how you perceive green could be very different from how I perceive green and how a banker perceives green.
It has taken a very interesting and insidious turn. So, for example, even when it came to the sovereign rating, you would think that this is a completely objective thing, that this should be based on the country's ability to pay or willingness to pay, debt GDP ratios, current account deficit, fiscal balance. These are all the objective measures, and fair enough, these should be a part of judging a government's capabilities. But not too many people realize that 20% of the weightage of the sovereign ratings is on various subjective factors like governance or voice and accountability or transparency, something entirely fuzzy. Since there is no accepted format for these ESG norms, these think tanks and NGOs, all of them based, by the way, either in Western Europe or in North America, all of them are basically coming up with their own indices. And they have extremely non-transparent ways they come up with. So if you go into any one of them, for example, one of these think tanks is Freedom House, or another one is VDEM in Sweden. So if you ask them how they do it and you go into their methodologies, you will see they're completely non-transparent.
An Indian company finds itself on weaker ground against one, say from Slovenia or even the Philippines, when looking for expansions abroad. Those are the negative effects of lower ratings to a country.
Supposing I'm a company, I want to be listed, or I want to export something to some other country. What will matter is my ESG rating will be a part of that, of the way in which I will have to transact. Similarly, global investment firms like JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley Asset Management, etc., they are also being pushed into a direction where their investment decisions will be driven, at least in part, by these ESG norms. The problem is the way they are being set up.
Rating agencies do influence investments, or that's the reason we are interested in the rating agencies. But I think all investors, direct investors as well as portfolio investors, know exactly what is happening. They have their own systems of analysis. So if they think the rate of growth is going to be 6.5%, they are not going to be driven by a rating agency saying it's going to be 5.5%.
India's economy, especially over the last decade, has witnessed tremendous growth. Even in the present difficult times geopolitically, India is the fastest growing major economy in the world. To give India weak ratings now certainly raises suspicions of hidden motives.
Well, that is a pecuniary ulterior motive, but I think there is a bias against emerging market economies. There is a bias against people you do not understand. There is a bias against people who seem to be a powerful voice increasingly. It is like having a bias against people who use their hands to eat and do not use knives and forks.
I am a strong believer that all these agencies, their business is in the business of credibility. But at the end of the day, people have made money in Indian markets, and people have realized that they need to kind of, have more exposure to India, both in equity, debt, even in, direct investments through, integration of supply chains and so on and so forth. So as long as investors are making money, if they don't upgrade the ratings, they would end up, facing a credibility challenge. So I think that the market mechanism, the way information networks work, a lot of these issues would eventually get ironed out, even if some vested interests are funding them and are behind. Because ultimately, none of these institutions would want to lose out on business.
Now, what can India do in order to battle the glaring bias? We can ignore them, as I reckon we do, or have competing rating agencies of our own, homegrown agencies. But that would be a long road because building credibility and reputation takes time.
The other way of looking at this is each of these rating agencies, when they work in India, they are actually licensed and regulated in India under SEBI. So if there is a bias, there is another political way that we can handle some of these bias by, I wouldn't say arm twisting, but actually showing them the mirror, saying how is it that they are unfair.
We now need to turn the gaze and be able to look at their numbers. You see, they'll come to India and say, this is bad, that is bad. The way you measure XYZ is wrong. If you go and look at the way they do it, it's even worse. This is a major problem in our intellectual world. We seem to have an inferiority complex that always, when we try to look at the rest of the world, we are almost fearful of doing it back to them.
Why should the Indian government do anything about it? Because these are private companies. I personally think we should not give undue emphasis to these rating agencies.
I think it will require a new generation of Indian intellectuals who are now emerging, new think tanks, new academics in India, or even based abroad, who will begin to challenge this status quo. But it requires a certain confidence in ourselves.
$390